The heat shimmer rose from the flight deck as pilots across Task Force 58 prepared for what would become the most decisive air battle of the Pacific War. It was June 19, 1944, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a massive Japanese fleet was moving toward them. 200 miles west of the Mariana Islands, the American carriers were positioned and ready. USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, USS Bunker Hill, USS Yorktown, and 11 other flat-tops launched wave after wave of Grumman F-6F Hellcats into the morning sky. The fighters climbed away from the pitching decks, their engines roaring with purpose, heading toward the approaching enemy formation. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell commanded the entire operation from his flagship, the Lexington. 15 carriers under his control, carrying a combined force of 905 aircraft, stood against Japan's desperate gambit to halt the American push toward their homeland. The Japanese were running out of options, and they knew it. What their naval aviators would discover in the hours ahead would shatter every assumption they'd held about aerial combat. Below deck, aboard the Japanese carrier Taiho, Lieutenant Sakioku Matsu adjusted his flight suit in the ready room as dawn broke across the Pacific. It was 0730 hours, and the tension hung thick in the air. The morning briefing had been crystal clear: maximum striking force against the American carriers detected east of Guam. Intelligence had pinpointed 15 large American flat-tops operating in 3 separate task groups southwest of Saipan. The information seemed solid. The Americans were there, and Japan had to strike them before they got closer. Sakioku Matsu was scheduled to fly escort for the second attack wave, the one that was supposed to deliver the knockout blow against the American invasion force. His Zero carried a belly tank that extended its range beyond 1,000 nautical miles, transforming the nimble fighter into something more like a long-range escort platform. It was a tactic born from earlier successes, from the days when Japanese aviation had ruled the Pacific skies. Those coordinated attacks against Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Ceylon had achieved remarkable results through experienced pilots flying superior aircraft. Commander Minoru Genda had developed tactics that made full use of the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability and impressive range. The whole doctrine depended on exploiting the Zero's ability to outturn any enemy fighter while maintaining longer endurance than American planes. A skilled pilot could dominate the sky through superior positioning and energy management, even when outnumbered. But this was Task Force 58, and it represented something the American Navy had never assembled before. 15 carriers, the most powerful carrier deployment since the war began. 6 of them were Essex-class vessels, each displacing 27,000 tons, with reinforced flight decks built to handle heavier aircraft. The American design philosophy was fundamentally different from the Japanese approach. Where Japan optimized for maximum aircraft capacity with lightweight structures, the Americans had prioritized durability and damage control. They accepted reduced speed in exchange for enhanced survivability against enemy attack. The F-6F Hellcat had entered service just the year before, in late 1943, as a direct American response to combat experience against the Zero. Grumman engineers had designed it specifically to counter Japanese fighters, incorporating lessons learned from captured Zero specimens and detailed pilot reports. The Hellcat weighed roughly 12,000 pounds when fully loaded, powered by a 2,000-horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine that pushed it to 380 miles per hour. Armor protection was comprehensive. 212 pounds of plate steel protected the pilot, the oil cooler, and the oil tank. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, capable of preventing catastrophic fires even after enemy gunfire pierced them. 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, each carrying 400 rounds, gave it firepower that exceeded any Japanese fighter's armament. The Japanese formation, launching from Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, consisted of 128 aircraft. They were heading west toward Task Force 58 at 24,000 feet, and the pilots saw no American aircraft during their initial approach. It seemed like they might have achieved tactical surprise. But many of these pilots had completed their training just months earlier, with barely 100 hours of total flight time. The war was consuming pilots faster than Japan could train them. What had once been a 3-year program had been compressed into just 6 months due to mounting losses throughout 1943. Basic combat maneuvers received minimal attention, while formation flying and navigation dominated the curriculum. Carrier landing practice averaged just 5 successful traps before these pilots deployed operationally. Among the formation, Lieutenant Junior Grade Takeshi Yamamoto represented one of the few genuinely experienced pilots remaining. He had accumulated over 600 combat hours since 1941, flying missions over the Dutch East Indies and Rabaul, where Japanese naval aviation had previously dominated. The Zero's reputation for invincibility had remained intact through 1942, despite increasing Allied resistance. But Guadalcanal had revealed troubling trends. American pilots had developed effective counter-tactics against what had once seemed unstoppable Japanese fighters. The thatch-weave defensive maneuver negated the Zero's turning advantage, while hit-and-run attacks exploited its vulnerability to concentrated firepower. Ensign Hiroshi Tanaka flew as Yamamoto's wingman, having graduated from the abbreviated flight training program just 10 weeks earlier. His entire flight experience amounted to 75 hours, with only theoretical knowledge of actual combat. Fuel shortages had forced the elimination of advanced combat training, and ammunition scarcity had limited gunnery practice to static ground targets. Most new pilots had never fired their weapons at moving aerial targets before entering combat. This created a severe tactical disparity within the Japanese formations. Veterans had to simultaneously engage enemy fighters while protecting inexperienced wingmen who lacked basic situational awareness. This burden reduced overall formation effectiveness, as the skilled pilots couldn't fully exploit their abilities while shepherding novices through their first real combat experience. The Americans, by contrast, had organized their defense with precision. Radar operators aboard USS Yorktown detected the incoming Japanese formation at 150 miles distance, providing 20 minutes of advance warning before visual contact. Fighter director officers vectored combat air patrol fighters toward specific intercept coordinates using precise radar plotting. This transformed aerial defense from reactive scrambling into coordinated interception with altitude and positional advantages already secured. The fighter director system represented a revolutionary command and control capability developed through 2 years of hard-earned experience. Each carrier maintained a combat information center where trained officers tracked every airborne contact using radar displays. Radio communications linked directors with airborne fighters, providing real-time tactical guidance throughout engagements. This centralized control maximized defensive efficiency by concentrating fighters at optimal intercept points. Commander David McCampbell led VF-15's 1st Division from USS Essex, climbing toward the incoming raid at military power. His 12 Hellcats maintained tight formation while following radar vectors toward their assigned targets. Each pilot averaged over 300 hours of flight time, with extensive gunnery and tactical training completed stateside. The American training program had expanded dramatically throughout 1943, producing 10,000 new naval aviators annually. Operational training units provided 500 hours total flight time, including 150 hours in actual combat aircraft types. Advanced fighter training had emphasized deflection shooting, energy management, and coordinated team tactics against dissimilar aircraft, simulating enemy capabilities. The Hellcat's design prioritized pilot survival through comprehensive protection systems. Armor plates surrounded the cockpit, including seatback, headrest, and floor panels totaling over 200 pounds. The bulletproof windscreen consisted of 1.5-inch laminated glass, capable of stopping 7.7mm rounds at point-blank range. Self-sealing fuel tanks used multiple rubber layers that expanded when punctured, preventing fuel leaks and fires. The robust airframe could withstand significant battle damage while maintaining structural integrity. Test flights had demonstrated that the Hellcat could absorb multiple 20mm cannon hits and remain controllable. This durability provided psychological confidence, as pilots knew their aircraft could survive encounters that would destroy enemy fighters. The Japanese formation encountered the first Hellcats at 09:15 hours, approximately 90 miles west of Guam. The American fighters attacked from above and behind, using their altitude advantage for high-speed diving passes. Ensign Tanaka broke left, attempting to force an overshoot, but the Hellcat followed his turn with surprising agility. The American fighter's superior power allowed sustained turning at speeds where the Zero's controls became heavy and unresponsive. Multiple 50 caliber rounds struck Tanaka's aircraft, severing control cables and puncturing fuel tanks that immediately ignited. The Zero's complete lack of armor protection proved catastrophic as armor-piercing rounds penetrated the thin aluminum structure. His aircraft exploded when flames reached the wing fuel tanks, a shocking destruction that contradicted everything Japanese pilots believed about their fighters' combat superiority. The psychological impact rippled through the formation as pilots witnessed their fighters destroyed with apparent ease. Commander McCampbell's division executed coordinated slashing attacks against the Japanese formation using superior speed and firepower. The Hellcats dove from 28,000 feet, reaching 450 miles per hour in their attack runs, before zooming back to altitude. This energy-based tactical approach negated the Zero's maneuverability advantage while exploiting its inferior high-speed handling characteristics. Japanese pilots attempted traditional turning engagements but couldn't force the Americans into sustained dogfights. Each Hellcat pilot maintained strict energy discipline, refusing to engage in low-speed turning battles where Zeros excelled. The Americans demonstrated remarkable teamwork, with wingmen protecting leaders during attack runs while maintaining mutual support throughout the engagement. This coordination reflected extensive multi-aircraft tactical training, emphasizing section and division tactics over individual combat prowess. The Hellcat's robust radio equipment enabled clear communications despite electromagnetic interference from dozens of simultaneous transmissions. Japanese pilots struggled with inferior radio systems that produced static and feedback, preventing effective tactical coordination. Many Zero pilots disabled their radios entirely due to constant interference, relying instead on hand signals and pre-briefed formations. This communication breakdown compounded tactical disadvantages as Japanese formations fragmented under coordinated American attacks. The first engagement ended with severe Japanese losses. 12 Zeros fell to Hellcat guns within 8 minutes. American pilots observed multiple characteristics that contradicted intelligence estimates of enemy capabilities. The Japanese fighters demonstrated poor gunnery with most bursts, passing harmlessly behind intended targets. Their evasive maneuvers followed predictable patterns, suggesting inadequate combat training and limited tactical repertoire. Several Japanese pilots abandoned advantageous positions through apparent confusion or inexperience, failing to exploit brief opportunities when Hellcats presented vulnerable angles. Lieutenant Alexander Varatsu from VF-16 aboard Lexington intercepted a second Japanese formation, attempting to penetrate the fighter screen. His section of 4 Hellcats engaged 12 enemy aircraft with devastating effectiveness, shooting down 6 planes in 8 minutes. Varatsu expended only 360 rounds from his 2,400-round ammunition load, demonstrating the effectiveness of American gunnery training. The concentrated firepower of 650 caliber guns proved overwhelming against the Zero's fragile structure. Short bursts produced immediate catastrophic damage, with wings separating, engines exploding, and fuel tanks igniting from incendiary rounds. The technological disparity became increasingly apparent as battle developed throughout the morning. Hellcats absorbed multiple hits from Japanese 7.7mm machine guns without significant damage, while their own weapons destroyed Zeros with minimal ammunition expenditure. American pilots reported enemy aircraft disintegrating under concentrated fire, often exploding after just 2 or 3 seconds of accurate shooting. The Zero's 20mm cannons posed a theoretical threat, but low muzzle velocity and limited ammunition reduced their practical effectiveness. Most Japanese pilots exhausted their cannon ammunition quickly through poor fire discipline, leaving only rifle-caliber machine guns for subsequent engagements. Radar-directed fighter control enabled efficient vector management as American fighters intercepted multiple incoming waves. Fighter direction officers maintained complete tactical awareness through radar tracking and pilot reports, positioning fresh fighters at optimal intercept points. This systematic defense prevented Japanese formations from coordinating mass attacks against the carrier force. Individual Japanese groups arrived piecemeal, encountering concentrated Hellcat formations positioned for maximum tactical advantage. The radars systematically suffered progressive attrition before reaching effective attack range of American vessels. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his second wave at 0856 hours, comprising 128 aircraft from all available carriers. The strike included 48 fighters, 53 dive bombers, and 27 torpedo bombers tasked with overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers. However, inexperienced pilots struggled with basic navigation as formations fragmented during the long approach flight. Several groups became lost entirely, wandering aimlessly while consuming precious fuel reserves before locating their targets. Lieutenant Russell Risira from VF-31 aboard USS Cabot intercepted the second wave's leading elements 60 miles from the task force, where the real test of American fighter supremacy was about to begin. His division of Hellcats swept in from out of the sun, catching the Japanese formation completely unprepared. The enemy pilots hadn't kept their eyes where they needed to be, leaving them wide open as the Americans closed in unseen. By the time the Japanese realized what was happening, it was already far too late. Within minutes, 5 Japanese aircraft were tumbling toward the sea, trailing thick smoke and orange flames as their wings and fuselages tore apart from the devastating assault. The surviving Japanese pilots pushed forward anyway, determined to press their attack despite the chaos erupting around them. But as they climbed higher, they found more Hellcats waiting at different altitudes, ready and eager for combat. The American fighters attacked the same way each time, diving down from above where they held all the advantage, then pulling up sharply to climb back to their perches. From start to finish, the Hellcats controlled the fight. The Japanese pilots found themselves unable to respond effectively, constantly reacting rather than acting. This overwhelming superiority came from 2 sources working together. The Hellcat itself was simply a superior machine, and the American pilots had trained extensively in how to use that machine to its fullest advantage. The Japanese pilots had been trained to fight in tight circles at slow speeds, where their Zeros could turn on a dime. But at high speeds, the Zero became sluggish and unresponsive, exactly where the Hellcat wanted to fight. When the second wave came against the task force, they barely made a dent. Scattered groups of Japanese aircraft struggled through the defensive screen in 1s and 2s, rather than in organized formations. The destroyers and cruisers in the task force screen threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible anything could get through. When a few Japanese aircraft did manage to slip past the fighters and reach the carriers themselves, they ran into even more concentrated defensive fire from multiple ships firing shells equipped with proximity fuses that exploded right in the aircraft's path. Only a single torpedo bomber managed to launch its weapon, and USS Indiana simply turned hard and avoided it without trouble. Commander McCampbell led the second Hellcat strike from VF-15 and spotted the third Japanese wave approaching at around 1100 hours. His 12 Hellcats found themselves facing over 40 enemy aircraft in a chaotic running battle that lasted 20 minutes. McCampbell himself shot down 7 Japanese planes during that fight, while his wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, added 4 more to the day's total. What happened in that engagement told the whole story of American versus Japanese naval aviation in 1944. The American pilots knew how to capitalize on every mistake the enemy made. The Japanese formations couldn't hold together. Individual aircraft started fighting separately just to stay alive, completely forgetting their original mission. From his damaged Zero, Lieutenant Commander Kenji Suzuki watched the third wave get systematically destroyed as he struggled back toward the Japanese fleet. His aircraft was torn up, multiple bullet holes punched through both wings and the fuselage, one elevator cable was completely severed, and the engine was running rough and threatening to quit at any moment. The losses were unimaginable. Nothing like this had happened before, not even at Midway, where at least some Japanese aircraft had gotten through to attack the American ships. Today, the pilots had thrown everything they had at the enemy and accomplished nothing while losing dozens of aircraft and pilots who couldn't be replaced. When pilots made it back, they reported something that shocked the Japanese command structure. They'd encountered an entirely new American fighter that performed far beyond anything the intelligence reports had predicted. Everything the Japanese knew about American fighters came from studying captured F-4F Wildcats, and those reports said American fighters were inferior in every way compared to the updated Zero variants, except maybe in a dive. But this new Hellcat could climb faster than the Zero, could turn faster at high speeds, and could take enormous punishment and keep flying. It was as if the Americans had deliberately designed a fighter to exploit every single weakness the Zero possessed. Admiral Ozawa received fragmented reports throughout the day that painted a picture of complete disaster. His pilots described an enemy fighter that appeared at every altitude and from every direction, with American aircraft always there, no matter where the Japanese tried to go. The defensive system the Americans had organized prevented any Japanese aircraft from concentrating their attacks. Instead, the American Hellcats kept them scattered and broken up, shooting them down in ones and twos with horrible efficiency. Radio signals that the Americans intercepted suggested their own losses remained minimal, even though they were outnumbered throughout the entire morning. The first wave that launched had carried 69 aircraft. Only 27 made it back, and many of those were barely flyable, shot full of holes and trailing fluid. The second wave fared even worse. From 120 aircraft, barely more than one-third limped home. These weren't just machines being lost, they were pilots being killed. Pilots who'd taken years to train during peacetime, pilots who couldn't possibly be replaced. The implications went far beyond just losing today's battle. This represented the destruction of Japanese naval aviation's offensive capability. The pilots who returned were shaken in ways that showed trauma far deeper than simple combat fatigue. Aviators who'd graduated from flight training just weeks earlier described pure terror and helplessness against an enemy that seemed impossible to kill. Their 7.7mm machine guns barely scratched the American fighters, while the American .50 caliber guns tore their aircraft to pieces. The myth of the Zero's invincibility, the belief every pilot had grown up with, shattered in those few hours of combat. Veterans like Yamamoto couldn't make sense of what was happening. They'd owned the sky for years across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. None of those victories meant anything when the enemy refused to fight the way Japanese pilots excelled. The foundation that Japanese naval aviation had built itself on, technical superiority and pilot skill, crumbled in a single morning. On the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, the reality of defeat became impossible to ignore. Maintenance crews walked past empty parking spots where aircraft should have returned. The decks that were designed to handle 75 aircraft each now held scattered remnants of what had been powerful air groups just hours before. Mechanics and armament personnel stood idle with nothing to do, no aircraft to repair, no weapons to load. The human cost became clear as friends and squadmates failed to return from what was supposed to be a decisive victory. Admiral Ozawa faced an impossible decision. He had only scattered aircraft left, maybe 35 operational fighters from the 400+ he'd started with that morning. A fourth wave of 82 aircraft sat on the flight decks, fueled and armed and ready to launch. But reconnaissance reports showed the American carriers were still fully operational despite taking 3 waves of attacks. Sending more pilots and aircraft at an enemy that had proven so completely superior seemed pointless. Yet command pressure from above pushed him to keep fighting rather than acknowledge what had actually happened. The problem was that accurate information wasn't getting through to senior commanders. Pilots' reports contradicted each other about how many American fighters were out there and what they could do. Staff officers struggled to put together any coherent picture of what was really happening. The traditional Japanese approach to warfare, that will and spirit could overcome material disadvantages, prevented anyone from honestly accepting that the enemy fighters were simply better. Many commanders refused to believe Japanese naval aviators could be so completely outmatched, regardless of how many enemy fighters showed up. The F-6F Hellcat's dominance stemmed from comprehensive design advantages that addressed every single aspect of aerial combat. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what the Zero's Sakai 21 engine generated. This massive power advantage translated into faster climbing, quicker acceleration, and superior performance at high altitudes, exactly the conditions where the Zero's already poor power-to-weight ratio became even worse. The Hellcat climbed at 3,500 feet per minute, while the Zero managed only 2,600 feet per minute. This meant American pilots maintained an energy advantage throughout every engagement. The Hellcat's firepower came from 650 caliber Browning machine guns, each equipped with 400 rounds of ammunition. Every gun fired at 850 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, maintaining a flat trajectory and devastating power at combat ranges. That meant over 100 rounds per second of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition capable of punching through engine blocks and igniting fuel tanks. The ammunition supply allowed 30 seconds of continuous fire, plenty of opportunity to engage without rationing ammunition. The Zero mounted two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. The cannons fired explosive shells that sounded impressive in theory, but had a low muzzle velocity of 2,460 feet per second, which meant pilots had to aim differently for cannons than for machine guns. The cannons carried only 60 rounds each, forcing pilots to be stingy with their shots. The 7.7mm machine guns simply lacked stopping power against the armor-plated American fighters, and with just 700 rounds each, they couldn't compensate for the poor penetration. American radar technology gave another decisive edge that went far beyond just the fighters themselves. The SK air search radar could detect aircraft over 100 miles away, while the SM height-finding radar determined altitude within 500 feet. Combat information centers collected all this data and plotted it on vertical display boards. Officers could then direct fighters using VHF radio to intercept incoming raids. This system transformed defense from individual pilot decisions into coordinated tactical operations that squeezed maximum efficiency from the defending forces. Japanese carriers didn't have anything comparable. Most ships relied on eyeballs and binoculars. The Type 21 air search radar installed on some vessels only detected targets out to 60 miles and wasn't very reliable. Without any height-finding capability or integrated fighter direction, Japanese combat air patrols operated independently, following outdated peacetime tactics. This meant nobody could efficiently allocate fighters against multiple incoming attacks, and flexibility during combat went right out the window. By late 1944, a brand new Japanese Navy pilot might graduate with just 40 hours of flight time. His American counterpart had logged at least 525 hours. American pilots received extensive training with camera guns that recorded how accurate they were during simulated dogfights. Formation flying received just as much emphasis, with pilots learning how to manage their energy, support each other, and work as sections rather than individuals. Operational training units provided realistic combat preparation with experienced instructors who'd rotated back from frontline squadrons. Japanese replacement pilots averaged maybe 100 hours total flying time with minimal combat training before getting sent to operational squadrons. The fuel shortage meant most flying instruction came from ground school, with limited actual flying hours in outdated training aircraft. Most pilots never fired a weapon at anything flying before going into combat. Formation flying emphasized parade ground precision rather than tactical flexibility. The abbreviated training program cut out aerobatics, instrument flying, and night operations that used to be considered essential. The difference in pilot quality magnified the aircraft performance gap throughout every engagement. Admiral Ozawa committed his remaining 82 aircraft anyway, hoping to inflict some damage on the American carriers before withdrawing westward. But these aircraft ran into even more intense fighter opposition. American carriers were recovering their earlier strikes, refueling and relaunching their fighters. The systematic destruction continued as Hellcats positioned at multiple altitudes engaged each group of incoming Japanese aircraft. By 1430 hours, American search aircraft had located the Japanese fleet 275 miles northwest of Task Force 58. Admiral Mitcher launched a massive strike, 216 aircraft total, despite the extreme range that demanded careful fuel management. The American strike included 85 Hellcat fighters, showing that these aircraft could do far more than just defend the fleet. While Japanese carriers were struggling to maintain minimal defensive patrols with whatever aircraft they had left, American carriers were hurling overwhelming offensive power toward the enemy. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. The morning had been about defense, keeping enemy aircraft away. Now it was about offense, going after the enemy fleet with everything available. The American strike found Japanese carriers almost defenseless. Only 35 operational fighters remained from over 400 aircraft that morning. The Hellcats swept aside the token opposition, while dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked without meaningful interference. The Heiho sank after multiple torpedo hits, while Zuikaku and Chiyoda suffered severe damage from bomb strikes. Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved ineffective against determined attacks pressed home by experienced American pilots. The return flight came after sunset, creating serious navigation challenges as pilots struggled finding their carriers in the darkness. Admiral Mitcher made an unprecedented decision. He illuminated his carriers despite the submarine threat, turning on searchlights and running lights to guide returning aircraft. This calculated risk prioritized recovering aircrew over ship security, showing American confidence in their tactical position. Despite losing some aircraft to fuel exhaustion and night landing accidents, personnel recovery reached 85% as destroyers rescued pilots from the water. The tempo continued as carriers prepared for dawn searches to find the retreating Japanese fleet. Admiral Ozawa acknowledged complete defeat. Only 35 operational aircraft remained from the 430 that morning. The Japanese fleet retreated, having accomplished nothing beyond confirming American aerial supremacy. The loss ratio exceeded 10-1 in favor of American forces. Japanese naval aviation had been effectively eliminated as an offensive force. The implications extended far beyond today's tactical defeat. Japan lacked the resources to rebuild carrier air groups before American forces approached the home islands. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that technological superiority, combined with superior training, could completely overwhelm enemy tactical doctrine, regardless of determination or experience. Japanese naval aviation had built its reputation on superior aircraft and extensively trained pilots, achieving decisive victories from 1941 to 1942. The Zero dominated every opponent through exceptional maneuverability and range. Pilots accumulated combat experience across multiple campaigns. This combination created psychological supremacy, where Allied pilots entered combat expecting to lose. The Hellcat's introduction reversed this dynamic completely through purpose-built design, specifically countering Japanese advantages. American designers made a calculated trade-off, accepting heavier aircraft in exchange for armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. This decision created a warbird capable of absorbing punishment that would obliterate a Zero instantly. The muscular engine delivered performance margins that let pilots control how engagements unfolded, steering clear of situations where the nimble Japanese fighter held its advantage. Those 650 caliber guns delivered devastating firepower, a sledgehammer against Japanese airframes built light as paper, designed for speed rather than battle survival. The American approach to pilot training revealed something profound about industrial-age warfare, crushing the old craftsman tradition. Japan struggled to produce hundreds of replacement aviators through rushed programs cutting corners everywhere. America instead developed thousands through methodical, scientifically designed curriculum built from hard combat lessons. It worked like an assembly line for pilots, consistent quality through standardized instruction and endless flying hours. Each American pilot functioned as an interchangeable part in a larger system, not an irreplaceable treasure whose loss crippled the whole unit. Radar-guided fighter direction demonstrated technological force multiplication beyond what any single aircraft could achieve. Positioning fighters perfectly before enemies appeared visually negated Japanese surprise attacks while maximizing defensive advantage. This systematic thinking transformed carrier task forces from easy prey into nearly impenetrable shields against air attack. Sensors, communications, and command structures working together created capabilities far greater than any individual piece could accomplish alone. Japanese naval doctrine, stubborn and unchanged, proved fatal when pre-war assumptions collided with wartime reality. The obsession with offensive carrier strikes for knockout victories became meaningless when facing an enemy refusing those terms. Americans embraced gradual attrition through endless operations, rather than seeking one climactic battle to decide everything. This patience, combined with industrial might, guaranteed eventual victory, no matter how individual skirmishes unfolded. The human toll extended beyond planes and pilots to the irreplaceable knowledge built through years of training and combat. Japan's pre-war naval aviators represented an elite corps whose skills demanded rigorous selection and lengthy development. Their deaths could never be replaced through shortened programs pumping out barely competent substitutes instead of true excellence. The spiral became vicious. Inexperienced pilots suffered losses at terrible rates, each casualty further weakening the overall force. Task Force 58 maintained operations off Guam despite Japanese attempts disrupting the landings through carrier strikes. June 20th brought fresh searches for the fleeing Japanese fleet while maintaining combat patrols against possible land-based attacks. American pilots who fought the previous day described it simply, like an old-fashioned turkey shoot. That phrase stuck, capturing both the lopsided nature of aerial combat and the mechanical efficiency of destroying Japanese aircraft. The final accounting revealed the scope of Japanese catastrophe. 445 aircraft destroyed, including 395 carrier planes and roughly 50 land-based fighters. American losses reached 123 aircraft, yet 80 fell to operational accidents rather than enemy action. Only 43 American planes fell to Japanese fighters and flak during those 2 intense days of aerial combat. The exchange ratio hit 10-1, surpassing every previous carrier battle, including the decisive victory at Midway. Far worse, Japan lost over 400 pilots, including experienced instructors pulled from training squadrons, the last surviving reservoir of skilled naval aviators. Admiral Ozawa's report to Combined Fleet Headquarters acknowledged something devastating. Japanese carrier aviation no longer existed as an offensive force. Ships and aircraft remained, but the trained pilots capable of conducting effective operations vanished. The mobile fleet, seeking a decisive engagement instead, demonstrated American aerial mastery. Strategic reality crystallized as American forces continued advancing toward Japan, essentially unopposed from the Imperial Navy. The technological revolution demonstrated at Philippine Sea influenced naval aviation development worldwide for decades. Radar systems, communications networks, and fighter control procedures established patterns every major navy would eventually follow, seeking carrier aviation capability. Pilot survivability through aircraft protection and systematic training replaced pre-war acceptance of staggering casualties. The Hellcat itself served through the Korean War, repurposed for ground attack roles, exploiting its rugged construction and heavy armament. American industrial superiority ultimately became decisive through quantity and quality advantages, overwhelming Japanese resistance, regardless of tactical brilliance or individual heroism. Producing thousands of aircraft monthly while training pilots to operate them effectively created insurmountable numerical dominance. Every American loss got replaced several times over, while Japanese losses represented permanent force degradation. Production numbers tell the story of Japanese hopelessness. America produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944, while Japan managed 28,000 despite complete national mobilization. The Hellcat achieved the highest kill ratio among American fighters, with 5,200 confirmed victories against 270 combat losses. That 19-1 ratio surpassed every other aircraft type, while accounting for 75% of all Navy aerial victories despite entering service halfway through the war. The F-6F validated the design philosophy, prioritizing pilot survival and firepower over raw performance, demanding superhuman skill. Veterans consistently praised the Hellcat's forgiving flying characteristics and capacity to absorb damage while remaining combat effective. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the Marianas disaster, relegated to suicidal kamikaze attacks, sacrificing pilots and aircraft for minimal strategic return. Decades of accumulated institutional knowledge evaporated in one day's combat against superior American forces. The Zero fighter, symbolizing Japanese aerial supremacy, became synonymous with obsolescence and vulnerability against modern American opposition. The psychological impact transcended military defeat to reveal spiritual determination could not overcome material inferiority when facing industrial democracy's production capacity. Philippine Sea represented the culmination of American naval aviation development from Pearl Harbor's devastation through methodical construction of overwhelming superiority. The carrier task forces Japan attacked in 1941, hoping to eliminate American Pacific presence, returned tenfold stronger with superior aircraft, pilots, and tactical doctrine. The shift from desperate defense to offensive mastery happened through systematic application of industrial resources, technological innovation, and operational analysis. The Hellcat fighter embodied this evolution from reactive response to Japanese initiative toward purposeful dominance through superior design and employment. Admiral Mitchell's after-action report emphasized the totality of victory while acknowledging fortunate circumstances, concentrating Japanese attacks against prepared defenses. Radar warning, fighter direction, and superior aircraft created perfect conditions for defensive success against conventional air attacks. Yet he cautioned future enemies might develop asymmetric responses, requiring continuous innovation rather than relying on proven formulas. This prescient observation anticipated the kamikaze phenomenon emerging from Japan's desperate attempts, offsetting conventional inferiority. Individual pilot experiences revealed the human dimension beyond statistical victory and defeat abstractions. American pilots described the surreal experience of downing multiple enemies with minimal effort, while feeling sympathy for opponents flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training. Japanese survivors recounted the horror of watching squadron mates destroyed without meaningful resistance against seemingly invulnerable opponents. These personal accounts captured warfare's essential tragedy, where technological superiority translated into human suffering, regardless of individual courage or determination. The Marianas Turkey Shoot entered aviation history, demonstrating American aerial supremacy achieved through systematic superiority in training, technology, and tactical doctrine. The battle proved modern warfare rewards industrial capability and scientific advancement over warrior tradition and spiritual determination. Japan's attempt achieving decisive victory through conventional carrier aviation ended in catastrophic defeat, eliminating naval aviation as an effective force. The Imperial Navy dominating the Pacific in 1942 became incapable of meaningful offensive operations by June 1944. Strategic consequences extended beyond immediate military defeat to fundamental reassessment of industrial-age warfare's nature. Japanese military leadership confronted mathematical certainty their nation lacked resources competing with American production, regardless of tactical innovation. The decision continuing despite inevitable defeat reflected cultural inability, accepting surrender rather than rational calculation. The kamikaze phenomenon emerged from this dissonance between accepting defeat's inevitability while refusing its implications. The sinking of carriers Shokaku and Taiho by American submarines on June 19 compounded aerial defeat with irreplaceable platform losses. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier engagement except Midway, succumbed to USS Cavala's torpedoes while recovering aircraft. Taiho, Japan's newest, most advanced carrier, featuring an armored flight deck, sank from a single torpedo hit, causing catastrophic internal explosions. These losses eliminated not merely vessels, but irreplaceable crew experience, impossible replacing before war's end. The technological and training advantages demonstrated at Marianas established patterns continuing through the Pacific War's remainder. American forces advanced inexorably toward Japan, while Japanese forces attempted increasingly desperate defensive measures without meaningful success. The carrier task forces, seeming vulnerable to Japanese attack in 1941, became unstoppable American power projection instruments by 1944. The transformation from defensive response to offensive supremacy occurred through methodical application of industrial democracy's advantages against military autocracy's limitations. Aftermath saw American carriers continuing Guam operations while Japanese survivors retreated to anchorages beyond American aircraft range. The invasion proceeded without meaningful interference from Japanese naval aviation ceasing existence as effective force. Airfields on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan soon hosted B-29 bombers, bringing strategic bombing to Japan's heartland. The carrier battle intended preventing this outcome instead confirmed American ability projecting power wherever national strategy required, regardless of Japanese opposition. Veterans remembering June 19, 1944, marked when American naval aviation achieved unquestioned supremacy over Japanese opponents. Months of preparation, training, and technological development culminated in hours of aerial combat, eliminating Japanese carrier aviation's offensive capability. The Hellcat fighter proved itself transforming American carriers from vulnerable targets into dominant naval power instruments. The pilots demonstrated systematic training, producing competent aviators in quantity overwhelming elite opponents through numerical and qualitative superiority. Lessons from the Turkey shoot influenced naval aviation development for decades as nations recognized integrating technology, training, and tactical doctrine's importance. Pilot survivability through aircraft protection became standard design philosophy, while radar-directed fighter control established fleet air defense patterns. American victory demonstrated industrial production, combined with technological innovation, creates military superiority traditional military virtues cannot overcome. The battle testified to democracy's ability, mobilizing resources effectively against authoritarian aggression when national survival demanded total commitment. The human cost, measured in Japanese lives lost during futile attacks against superior forces, represented warfare's essential tragedy, where courage could not overcome material disadvantage. Young Japanese pilots, dreaming of glory defending homeland, instead died in obsolete aircraft, overwhelmed by enemies they could not effectively engage. Their sacrifice achieved nothing beyond demonstrating American superiority while depleting Japan's remaining trained aviator reservoir. Survivor guilt experienced by pilots returning from missions, losing squadron mates, became defining characteristic of Japanese naval aviation's final period. The Hellcat's success validated design philosophy, prioritizing pilot survival and consistent performance over exceptional capability, demanding superhuman skill. Average American pilots achieved extraordinary results, flying aircraft forgiving mistakes while delivering devastating firepower against fragile opponents. The zero demanding perfection from pilots offering no error margin became liability when pilots lacked extensive training and combat experience. Design philosophy contrasts reflected deeper cultural differences about valuing human life versus achieving objectives regardless of cost. Philippine Sea marked carrier aviation's end as balanced competition between opposing forces with complementary advantages. American technological and training superiority created conditions where combat became execution rather than genuine contest with predetermined conclusions. The Japanese pilots launching June 19th flew into predetermined destruction, lacking realistic capability, achieving objectives against prepared American defenses. The Turkey shoot metaphor captured this essential imbalance where one side held overwhelming advantages, guaranteeing victory regardless of enemy actions. Strategic implications extended throughout Pacific War's remainder, as Japan could not rebuild carrier aviation capability before eventual defeat. The pilots lost during one morning represented years of training investment, impossible replacing through abbreviated programs, producing marginally competent substitutes. Decades of accumulated institutional knowledge disappeared when experienced pilots died without transferring skills to next generations. The qualitative collapse became irreversible as inexperienced pilots suffered disproportionate losses in subsequent operations, further degrading effectiveness. June 19, 1944, witnessed Japanese naval aviation's destruction as effective military force through systematic American superiority demonstration. The Hellcat fighter served as this victory's principal instrument, combining protective design, powerful armament, and superior performance in an aircraft average pilots could employ effectively. Radar warning, fighter direction, and coordinated tactics created defensive efficiency, overwhelming Japanese attacks, regardless of determination or tactical innovation. The battle proved industrial democracies could produce military superiority through methodical application of technological and training advantages against traditional opponents, relying on spiritual factors, overcoming material disadvantages. The Marianas Turkey Shoot entered history as the decisive moment when American naval aviation achieved supremacy, continuing through Pacific War's conclusion. The Japanese carriers, once projecting power throughout the Pacific, became floating targets for American aircraft they could not effectively oppose. The transformation from Pearl Harbor's vulnerability to Philippine sea dominance demonstrated democracy's capacity for military regeneration, facing existential threats. The battle stood as proof that freedom's arsenal, properly mobilized and directed, could defeat aggression regardless of initial advantages held by authoritarian opponents, mistaking temporary superiority for permanent dominance.